Great, thank you. And everyone's able to see my slides all right? Yeah? Okay, perfect. I guess we can get started here. Yes, we thought we would start with just a few introductions to who we are and how we got involved in the project. Manoj, would you like to go first?
Sure. My name is Manoj Lalu. I'm an anesthesiologist here in Ottawa at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. I'm a scientist as well too. Relevant, I guess, to this particular topic is the fact that I did my PhD and a couple of postdocs in the lab, actually. So doing, laboratory-based research. I'm now in clinical epidemiology here, and our group actually focuses on how to translate things from bench to bedside. So discoveries in the lab and how to translate that efficiently, to the bedside in patients.
Okay, thanks, Manoj. And my name is Dawn. I see lots of familiar names in the audience, so thanks very much for coming. I think you may have seen that from our Twitter promotions, and feel free to use our Twitter handles as we go. So yeah, I'm Dawn. I'm actually a basic scientist by training. I'm an analytical chemist by training. I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis about 15 years ago, and with osteoarthritis more recently. My diagnosis really shifted my entire career. I can say that very affirmatively. And for the past close to decade, I've really been working to help bring patient and caregiver voices to different aspects of research and healthcare. And being a patient partner myself, once in a while, I will also serve on teams as a patient perspective. So that's what I'm here doing today. And Manoj and I met, I think, about maybe 4 years ago at a conference about clinical trials, and we go back to our Edmonton days, it turns out. So it's nice to be part of this team. And I'll pass it over to Grace next.
Thanks, Dawn. My name is Grace Fox. I'm currently in my second year of the Masters of Epidemiology program at the University of Ottawa, and I'm co-supervised by Dr. Manoj Lalu. But before starting my master's, I was a research assistant for Manoj's group, and that's where I was first introduced to patient engagement. And since then, it's been my primary focus and research interests, and something that I want to focus my thesis on as well.
Okay, so I think we're going to start with a poll. And Grace, do you want to launch it? Yep. So I think we'd really like to understand a bit about who's in the audience. So we're just asking you if you're comfortable to identify, kind of your primary role or your primary perspective that you're bringing today as you watch the webinar. So just helps us know a bit about who our audience is and who's here. So we'll just give you a minute or two. And I apologize, we've listed other, but we haven't really asked you to describe yourself. So if you feel like it, if you're an other, and I don't want to call you that, but if you're an other, if you feel comfortable and you want to post in the chat what your role is, that would be great too. So it seems like most people are, you're either a clinical scientist, a research assistant, associate, or trainee. On the clinical side of things, you're a patient partner or you're other. So thanks a lot for doing that to start off with. There you go. You should be able to see the results there. Thanks, Katarina. I see that you've identified yourself as an organizational researcher at the University of Eastern Finland. So thanks for joining us today. Okay, so as we go through the talk, we thought of some things that you might, just kind of wish to have in the back of your head as we're speaking, because I think sometimes if you try and relate what you're hearing to your own work or some of the work that you do, it can sometimes, help you have some light bulb moments or really help you consider how you might incorporate a bit of what we're talking about into the work that you do. So we'd ask you to consider how patient perspectives can be considered within your research program, or maybe if you're a patient partner, for you to think about how your perspectives might contribute to a research project or research program, or maybe some other ways that you'd like to contribute that you're not currently. We're not going to lie, there are resources sometimes that you might need to engage with patient partners. And we'll talk about some of those today. They might be supports like things that Bryn could point you towards, because I know, Bryn's really engaged in this area of research. So she's an excellent resource for you. It might include a budget though, and we'll talk about that a bit too. It might include training for your team or for patient partners on your team. So, those are some things for you to think about. And then obviously we're biased, so we're going to ask you to think about how you might benefit from working with patient partners, or honestly, how you as a patient partner might benefit from being part of a research team. And, I'm being cheeky here. There can be some tough times sometimes associated with working with patient partners, so I don't want to shy away from that. But we didn't list that. But again, that might be something that you think about, just to be realistic as well. So we want to make sure that everyone's on the same footing, so to speak. And so we're going to use some terms throughout the talk. And we thought it would be beneficial to define those before we get going and make assumptions that everybody knows what we're talking about. So we've taken these definitions from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or CIHR. I know some of you are quite familiar with the funding agency in Canada. And CIHR basically defines patient engagement as a collaboration or partnership between researchers and patient partners. So, researchers, clinicians bring really valuable scientific and medical expertise. And then patient partners bring to the team that lived experience that complements what many people go to school for many years to gain. And no doubt about it, patient partners spend many years in systems and many years living with conditions or diseases that, provide them with all kinds of knowledge and information about those diseases that sometimes our clinicians and treating physicians don't always have insights into. And then CIHR, can you go back, Grace? Thanks. CIHR defines a patient partner quite broadly as anyone with lived experience. So that might include someone who's living with a disease or condition or has an experience in the healthcare system, but it could also include their caregiver, their family member, their child, their spouse, and even friends for that matter. So they all bring perspectives in whatever their relationship is with that individual about their engagement with the healthcare system or with their disease or condition. So you might wonder, well, so how can patient partners be involved? That's all good and dandy. And, we just thought we'd throw out some things again to get the juices flowing for people. So patient partners might be involved in helping set priorities for research projects or for funding agencies, quite honestly. And they might be part of identifying outcomes that are important to them or that might serve really huge unmet needs for them. When we talk about how this actually works, I'm going to encourage you to think outside the box as well. Your patient partners might contribute to these types of things in ways that the rest of the team doesn't. And so, for example, it might be as simple as listening to someone really carefully, listening to them talk about their experiences, about what they've been through in the system or with their condition, and listening for areas where they've struggled, where they haven't had good support. And those might be areas of unmet needs for them or their community. So, they might not come to the table and say, look, these are the 4 things I need you to research. It might be a lot more subtle than that, but they can certainly contribute to these areas. And then knowledge translation, is quite an obvious one. It's often the first place many people go in terms of patient partners sharing information that results from research projects. And don't underestimate, please, the communities that patients develop and the bonds that they develop with each other. They're often very up to date and in the latest and greatest in research. And they also share with each other lots of tips and tricks about living with specific conditions, navigating the health system, etc. So these are just some ways patient partners can be involved. Again, we'll talk a lot more as we go through things and give you some more ideas too. So again, just to kind of get things going, how can patient engagement enhance the clinical research space? So, maybe some of you already have experience with this, working with patient partners right from the idea phase, developing a funding application where they provide you with input to that application, you talk about things. Again, you might not always engage them in the same way with some of these areas that you do with your other research team members. I mean, ideally, this leads to a greater relevance of your research question because you've engaged patients in developing that and developing what your research project looks like or your proposed research looks like. There can often be greater interest in research when patient partners share it amongst their communities and share it with other patient partners. And then kind of like knowledge translation, recruitment and retention are sort of obvious ones that when you engage people with lived experience around the area in which you're doing research, they'll be pretty blunt with you about, like, I'm not going to go to a site 2 hours from my home 5 times a week to fill out a survey, right? Or is there any way we can put this online? Or, what could we do? And you'll be surprised some of the ideas too that come out of some of those conversations. So those are, again, this is not an inclusive list, but some ideas to get you started and thinking about how working with patients might help you out in terms of what you do as a researcher. So many of you may have noticed that there's sort of this momentum too in terms of globally engaging with patients as partners, not just in research, but also within academic publishing. And I know some of you on the call have a lot of interest in this area in terms of patient partners being authors on publications. But the British Medical Journal quite a few years ago struck a patient panel. So I'm part of their patient panel. They started having patient partners write blogs, advising the journal on things globally that are happening in patient engagement or areas that are of interest to patients. Having patient partners as reviewers on journal articles themselves. JOST is another one of them. And I think I saw Joletta Belton as part of the call today, and she actually is their patient editor. So she's part of the editorial group. And I know that Joe has played a big role in, having patient partners do blogs, as well as writing on a series about patient engagement in research. And research involvement and engagement is another open access journal where patient partners are on the editorial board, they're reviewers, and there's a lot of patient partners that you'll see in the published literature and research involvement and engagement. So that's from the publishing world. There's others too that aren't mentioned there. And in terms of funding agencies in Canada, there's CIHR has its strategy for patient-oriented research. We've called out this Ontario Spore Support Unit because they've funded some of our work. But I know in the Maritimes, there's the Maritime Spore Support Unit as well. And then some of the NCs or Network Centers of Excellence in Canada are also stipulating that patient partners either must be or are strongly encouraged to be part of research teams and part of research projects. So just to give you a flavor for kind of this increased momentum that patient engagement's being highly encouraged, and it's, I'll say we're starting to infiltrate places that have not normally seen us around. Okay, so we're going to go to our second poll now. And I believe that this poll is about kind of your level of knowledge related to patient engagement. So you might be at the level of patient what, or you might be at the level of, hey, I know exactly what that is, and I've worked a lot with patients. So that's what we're hoping you can tell us a little bit about here before we really start to go into explore the research project that we're here to talk about today. So it looks like nobody is willing to admit they know nothing about patient engagement, which is totally fine. We're not here to shame anybody. It looks like most of you have heard of it, or you've worked with patient partners a bit, or it looks like some of you have quite a bit of experience. And I know many of you on the call identify as patient partners. So I apologize for the wording of some of our polls, because I'll be honest, I don't think we were expecting this many patient partners, which is totally cool. Okay, so there you go. You can see the results, I hope, right now. And I know I'm going to pass it off to Manoj and Grace for a few slides.
Thanks, Dawn. So I thought we could switch gears now and start talking about how patient engagement might play out in preclinical research. So, I think probably one of the first things on people's minds are, why would you want to do that? I think you have to really think back to the place of preclinical research in the whole research spectrum. So preclinical research or laboratory-based research is early in the sort of translational pipeline if we're thinking about therapies for patients or interventions for patients. So if we had patient engagement in preclinical research, there's a thought that, well, maybe we might be able to align research priorities at this very, very early stage of research with patient priorities. Ultimately, if that was to happen, perhaps we might be able to reduce overall research waste. And I think also, very importantly, I think there's the opportunity with patient engagement preclinical research to potentially increase public trust in laboratory-based research. So unlike clinical research, where I think there's a lot of pieces of clinical research which are quite intuitive. If you're a person, don't need to be a scientist at all. If you're a person, you hear about a clinical trial, you hear about the nuts and bolts of a clinical trial. Usually most of us can figure out what that trial was about and a general gist about it, and can maybe even imagine how that might look. However, the lab is quite different, right? So it's behind closed doors. In most research institutes, that's literally behind security doors. So you can't even get in unless you have a special pass, right? So because of that, it's not public facing. It's not patient facing. And the flip side is that the scientists behind these closed doors often have no interaction with patients. I know I went through my PhD before my medical training, and I never had any patient engagement at all. So I was studying sepsis, which is a life-threatening infection, but I never met anyone or family members that had dealt with sepsis personally. So, I think that would have been eye-opening for me. Would it have changed my question? Perhaps not, but it would have probably made me think about things in a different way and frame my research in a different way as well too, and put a real, obviously a human face to what's actually, what this disease state is actually about as well too. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for shared information as well and exchange information. So in terms of, sorry, Grace, I'll just mention one other thing here, if you want to go back for a moment. The real stimulus for this particular project that we'll tell you about was actually a meeting that we had. So I do have a wet lab as well too, meaning I've got a laboratory. And one thing we're really interested in still is sepsis. So some things that I studied from my PhD onwards. We had a national meeting where we brought sepsis researchers from across the country to actually Niagara-on-the-Lake, and we had a discussion there around how to move sepsis research forward in Canada. We invited one patient partner, and she was a member of Sepsis, the Sepsis Foundation, which is a patient advocacy organization for sepsis in Canada. And at the end of the day, we were both sort of scratching our heads thinking, oh, what were you doing here? And, how could we make this better? And how could we actually engage you in this whole process? Because a lot of discussions were really around this nitty gritty of what's happening in labs, et cetera. So based on that experience, we actually put together a CRHR grant, a couple of grants, and that funded the work that Grace is going to be telling you about here in the next few slides, where we actually explored how patients can actually be engaged in preclinical laboratory-based research, and how might we improve that process as well too. So basically within this program of research, we'll be telling you about the first two components, which is a scoping review, where we looked into literature to see what has been published in terms of patient engagement in preclinical research. Secondly, we conducted an interview study. So these are semi-structured interviews with stakeholders identified from the scoping review. So the scoping review, again, identified literature that's already out there on this particular topic. And then we actually contacted the authors and asked them to connect us with their patient partners within their teams that had helped with these particular projects. Our team actually interviewed them to find out a bit more information. And then finally, the stage we're at right now is framework development. So we're trying to build a framework for engaging patients as partners in preclinical research. So I'll hand it over to Grace now.
Thanks, Manoj. Yeah, so based on our introduction, it's clear to see that most, if not all, of our understanding of patient engagement really comes from clinical research, which means that our understanding of engagement in preclinical laboratory research remains unclear. So for our scoping review, this was our overarching research question. So how are patients engaged in preclinical laboratory research? And so I do want to start off and mention up front, obviously, that we have two patient partners on our team who have been very involved throughout the development and conduct of this scoping review, specifically throughout protocol development. All team members were invited to attend regular team meetings where we provided updates and we discussed next steps for the program. Our patient partners also identified additional data extraction items, and they helped out with the content analysis. So this included interpreting some of the statements that we were extracting from the studies that were included in the scoping review. And both patient partners are co-authors on published manuscripts. And of course, we have one of our patient partners here today helping present these findings. So in terms of the methods for the scoping review, we conducted our review in accordance with the gold standard methodology. So that included drafting a protocol ahead of time and publishing this protocol. We then systematically searched several databases to identify potentially relevant studies to be included in the review. From here, all identified studies were screened against pre-specified eligibility criteria by two independent reviewers. And then for those studies that met our inclusion criteria and were ultimately included in our review, we extracted data using a formal data extraction form. And from here, content analysis was conducted on these included studies. So this process included extracting verbatim statements about any benefits, challenges, or enablers of patient engagement from these included articles, and then overarching themes were synthesized across verbatim statements. So diving right into the results here, after screening all potentially relevant studies, we identified 32 studies that were eligible to be included in the review. So these studies described or studied patient engagement in preclinical laboratory research. And while 32 may seem like a lot for a review, it does make up a very small proportion of the wealth of preclinical laboratory research that is available. But nonetheless, the two most commonly studied areas of research for these studies were genetic and musculoskeletal conditions. Quite a few studies recruited or reported recruiting their patient partners through patient organizations. And we identified 20 studies that engaged patients, so individuals with personal lived experience. But we also came across 7 studies that engaged caregivers as well. So one aspect of patient engagement that we were extremely interested in was the level at which patients were engaged within the individual project. So to do this, we categorized engagement activities as occurring at one of these 6 levels of engagement. And so this spectrum is outlined by the International Association of Public Participation Spectrum. It's depicted on the slide here. And one item to note is that as you move from the left, or the level on the left, to the level on the right, there's an observed increased impact that patient partners have on decision making. So here you can see from our studies that we were able to identify examples of engagement occurring at each of the levels of engagement. And what's of most interest here are these 6 studies on the far right at the empower level. And so the empower level of engagement is achieved when patient partners are the ultimate decision makers throughout the research process. And so these 6 studies here reported having a steering committee or an advisory board of patient partners, where the purpose of this committee was to oversee the overall direction of the project and be consulted and be involved in decision making throughout the conduct and development of these individual projects. And one study in particular listed one of their patient partners as a co-investigator on the project, which I thought was very interesting. But just as we were interested in the level of engagement, we also wanted to get an idea of what stage of the research process patient partners were engaged or contributed to. So we took the overall research process and divided it into various stages. And then we categorized activities as occurring at one or one of these stages. And so what we found was that the majority of studies engaged patients at the education or the priority setting stages of research. And so activities here included conducting focus groups or roundtable discussions to really streamline the priorities of patients with those of researchers. It's important to note that we did not identify any examples of patient engagement at the data collection or data analysis stages. But these 4 studies at the funding stage were quite interesting. One in particular reported that their patient partners fostered a relationship or established a relationship between the research team and a funding agency that actually supports preclinical laboratory research. And so this was framed as a clear benefit to the researchers because this relationship wouldn't have been established without the help of their patient partners. So that was actually captured in our content analysis as well, because we were interested in identifying any reported benefits, barriers, or enablers to engagement in this space. And so while this list is not exhaustive, some of the key reported benefits of engagement in preclinical research included providing a mutual learning opportunity, which both stimulated patient partner interest in basic science research, but also allowed researchers to see the real life implications of their work. Another benefit was increased research efficiency, and this was mostly a result of patient partners playing a role in the dissemination of research findings. One key reported barrier that was reported was this difference in knowledge and research experience, and how this may both limit meaningful engagement and also challenge communication between researchers and patient partners. And finally, one of the key reported enablers to engagement in this space was creating an environment where all team members feel comfortable sharing their individual views, and any training or resources to really support the process of engaging patients in this area. Okay, so with that said, our scoping review, through the scoping review, we gained a good understanding of the current standing of patient engagement in preclinical research, but we did want to gain a more in-depth perspective of different elements that are of importance for this partnership and any solutions to these barriers or different roles or activities that could take place. So we conducted qualitative semi-structured interviews with the researchers and the patient partners that were identified by the scoping review. And so these interviews were conducted using a virtual conferencing software. And so these audio recordings were recorded and then transcribed. And then from here, we conducted a thematic content analysis on these interview transcripts to gain an idea of overall themes across the different interviews.